So the capabilities that were identified, this is just a very quick summary list. You can go to the website to get the more detailed names of all of them. Obviously, the bio sector is very, very important, not just domestically but globally. And there's things around tools, there's things around the use of biotechnologies for security. There are biological systems, which is basically how does an ecology of a certain species work, or how does the chemistry inside the human body work, and so on. There are more material sciences type areas. Characterization is a really poor name for basically things like small-scale particle accelerators, light beams, synchrotrons, and so on. There are various initiatives under health, population health, electronic record linkage, those sorts of things. The typical, what in the US our colleagues call homeland security. Then obviously the big sciences. Australia has a very strong history in astronomy. I used to be an astronomer, so I'm allowed to get away with calling them all sorts of things. The ecology and environmental sciences. Obviously marine is a big area for us, as is geology. Australia is very much a primary industries sector, so geology is important to us. And then large-scale, power-intensive but environmentally friendly initiatives was another area. And the last one, the one that was under for infrastructure, was called Platforms for Collaboration. And again, I'll come back to it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that they did in picking these winners was that they didn't pick any of the humanities and social sciences. Given that the HAS sector is probably close to 50% of the research activity in Australia, this was somewhat surprising. However, they kind of felt that because it was so large and so diffuse, there wasn't really one group to talk to. And the reason that became a problem is because of the way eResearch was set up. What they set out to do was to say, okay, each of those 15 areas can be funded to a reasonable sizable amount, between $20 and $70 million over 4 to 5 years. However, there shall only be one proposal for each. Basically, it meant that they would encourage everybody who was in one of those particular areas, please collaborate, or you don't get any funding whatsoever. So it is friendly collaboration by force. That's a bit challenging for the research community, and I'm sure in Canada it would be much, much easier. All of your researchers get along really well. The way that they set this up was to basically find a facilitator, which was basically some retired consultant from the discipline who was seen as reasonably politically neutral, to go around the country and say, okay, let's pretend we got $50 million. What would we do with it? They were given about 6 months to plan. In the case of astronomy in Australia, I don't know if in Canada, in Australia they do this thing called the decadal plan, where basically they assume that they're going to get the same amount of money from the government that they got in the last decade, and they say, okay, if we get that money, what are the important things to spend it on? And so every decade they go through that exercise and produce a little book, very glossy, shiny, very nice book. And when they did that last was about 12 months before eResearch opened up. And so they simply reached in their back pocket, grabbed the decadal plan, put it on the table, and they had their money in 3 weeks. Everybody else, for the most part, took 6 months. However, of the 15, at this stage, I think 8 are funded. 2 have taken over 18 months to get their plan together and have only recently been funded. And the others are basically still in limbo because they still can't agree. But of that $540 million, I think they've now spent basically $500 and a couple. So there's not much money left in that pot now. There is an understanding that there will be a future round of eResearch in some form, but at the moment eResearch is being reviewed and they want to see whether it makes sense to do the same thing again or whether they could do it a bit better next time round. So some of those capabilities may be funded later, and there may be more capabilities added, and the HAS sector in particular is an obvious one. The money that came out of these programs was delightfully flexible. You could spend it on infrastructure, and you could spend it on people. And that meant that it didn't really matter what kind of plan you developed. You weren't tied to particular funding rules. there's a reason I'm stressing that now because it comes a bit later. But part of the planning that these capabilities had to come up with was to seek an ongoing business model. They wanted an organisation that they could sign a contract with that would then look to make an ongoing business model out of this infrastructure investment. That could be a fee for service, it could be a subscription model, whatever. At the end of the day, they only want to spend this money on this scale, once every very long period. They don't want to have to sort of say, oh, we just gave you one of those and you're asking me for another $500 million. Now, that is going to always be the case for things like our Antarctic vessels, because they basically are $500 million in one go. But for this sort of mid-range infrastructure, they said, we want something that is going to endure, and that the sector takes it on. Next slide, please. So how do you manage this kind of process? Well, NCRIS used to have an NCRIS committee. More recently, it was renamed NRIC, the National Research Infrastructure Council. When I saw that, my first comment was, what happened to collaboration? When I queried this with the department, they said basically what they're trying to do is to broaden the base. What they're basically saying is that they want to look at all of the research infrastructure across the country. NCRIS was one funding program. It may not exist in the future, but any other funding programs could then go under the governance of this body here. It is a very high-level council. They are senior government people, the heads of the major agencies, science agencies and so on, the heads of major research bodies, the vice-chancellors, deputy vice-chancellors of some of the big universities. It's the kind of thing that you'd expect, the most senior public servants to go to, and possibly even the minister would pop in from time to time. Within the Australian structure, it sits in the Federal Department of Innovation, Industry, Science and Research. It's sort of one of the more newer departments, and innovation has suddenly popped up all over the place, I think, globally. And they stress the fact that innovation comes first in that list. All right, now to the meat. Next slide, please. The platforms for collaboration was one of those capability areas, and generally is described as the IT bit of it. The idea is to look at, if you think of the capabilities as verticals across each of their areas, then PFC is the horizontal that spans all of them. The structure of NCRIS was to get PFC to focus on the NCRIS capabilities, but basically it could stretch to any research discipline that it saw could get some benefit out of this, and, oh, could you please go fix the HASS people that we annoyed the first time? Yes, I'm going to keep harping about that because they do. They left the facilitation for PFC to quite a later stage to allow all of the other capabilities to work out what they actually needed in IT. What that encouraged, of course, is tossing over the fence. Each of those capability areas said, oh, we need some infrastructure, so we need a microscope and we need a database that captures the data from that microscope. But, oh, PFC could build that for us. And then PFC had the exercise of pushing back to say, hang on a minute, yes, I can give you a database service, but I'm not going to build one that is specifically for microscopes. You guys are going to have to come to the party with that as well because you understand what you need out of that. So there's this boundary issue with all of those capability areas. Interestingly, some of the programs, some of the capabilities, like fabrication, said, oh, we have no IT needs whatsoever. This surprised pretty much everybody, and somebody noted that this is probably why most of our fabrication occurs in China. The other part of PFC's role is to make sure that there's a national coordination of the infrastructure and that it's globally aligned. At the end of the day, our researchers do not respect state or national boundaries. They work with whoever they think they need to work with, and that means that we inherit the discipline requirements where they exist from a global environment. That basically means that you can't choose to not adopt European standards for some grid technology activities or American standards for grid technologies. We have to do all of them. And then try and encourage those disciplines to coordinate and get a bit more strategic.